Now look, I just gotta come out and say, as an American, I knew very little about Ladas before this video. They're pretty much non-existent here in the US as they were never officially imported here, but from my understanding, they were available through most of Europe and very common, so please bear with me as I try to unpack this Soviet car from an American perspective. Honestly, all I knew these things for previously were these crazy drift videos on YouTube. These things are rear-wheel drive and apparently really cheap in Europe, so they get turned into these crazy drift cars like some wild Russian AE86. But anyways, let's take a look at what we actually have here today, a 1984 Lada 1300 SL, also called a Riva in some places and Nova in others. There are quite a few similar variations of this car with different parts and engines, so more specifically, this is a 2106 model. For a bit of background, Lada is the export name for this Soviet car brand. The local Russian name of the brand was Zhiguli, but they picked Lada for foreign markets because Zhiguli was too hard to pronounce for non-Russian speakers and sounded too much like gigolo. That's epic. As mentioned, they were not only found in Russia, but the rest of Europe as well as these simple to work on, affordable cars. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, the brand continued on and is now part of Renault, a French brand that is also never seen here. Now, you may be wondering, why the hell is there a Lada in the middle of nowhere, Washington, and why do we have it? Well, I honestly think my dad is a Russian spy and this is his Aston Martin. But for real, there was this Soviet car collector in Seattle that had an extra one of these, so he put it up for sale. As for why my dad bought it, well, as you know from this series, my family is very into classic Fiats, and coincidentally enough, this Lada, though being a completely different company, is actually based on the Fiat 124 platform. That's right, the same platform my Fiat 124 Spider is from. So not only is it Russian, but it's also a Fiat. Double the reason it never came to the US, I guess. And just looking at the car, it basically looks the same as the Fiat 124 Sedan, but there are differences I'll mention later. The design is very simple but distinct. It's so cartoonishly boxy and chunky, but not really a big car. It's clear that it's gone for a more utilitarian and practical design than a sleek and inspiring one. The yellow paint is probably the most eye-catching thing the car has looks-wise. But versus the look of modern cars nowadays, its simplicity is charming to see. At first glance on the interior, I'm actually more impressed with what they did here. Whoever designed the interior did a very good job. You can tell it's a budget car with the materials used. There are cloth seats, vinyl door panels, and a fake wood dash. But they picked nice dark brown colors for everything and kept it simple, but gave just small bits of flair. It all looks way nicer than it is. Again, it's by no means luxurious, but I think they nailed the looks for what they were working with at least. Cause though it looks nice at first, once you actually sit and touch everything, you definitely feel the cheapness. I mean, I like it better than those terribly gray and plasticky 90s interiors at the very least. Plus, I'm not really sure how to describe it, but it feels very Russian. It must just be the shade of brown used and the little decorations I mentioned, but you don't really get that vibe with other cars. And it's also very roomy and comfortable, again thanks to the chunky design of the car giving plenty of cabin space. It's nice to sit in and you got ashtrays on the doors too. Very 70s European. Overall, the looks of the car are not anything special, but I still can't help but just like these old cars. Popping open the hood, we also have some conservative but functional inners too. It's a 1.3 liter inline 4 with a single overhead cam pumping out about 60 horsepower. Probably not quite enough to live out your drifting fantasy stock, but you do have a shocking amount of free space to work with. It's rare you see an engine bay this empty. Like, geez, you could fit a twin turbo setup or almost even a second engine in here. As I mentioned before, the Lada 1300 is based on a Fiat 124, but it's not just a rebadge necessarily. Lada worked to make the car more durable and friendly to work on in case anything was needed. Some people claim them to be very reliable, while others say they break down every drive in true Fiat fashion. Regardless, out in the middle of Soviet Russia, you don't have many mechanic shops everywhere. I mean, it's just rural nowhere, so being able to do home fixes was important. They also made the suspension softer and stronger specifically to survive the unpaved dirt and gravel roads out there. And the other difference between the Fiat and Lada is the Lada has drum brakes while the Fiat has discs. And there's a few other little things here and there to improve the durability. One other addition they added is one I've never seen on a car before. Russia is pretty darn cold, and this can kill car batteries, especially if the car isn't being used every day, which, you know, if you live in a small village or town, you may not need to use your car all the time. So what do you do when your car battery is always dying and you don't have anyone to give you a jump? Well, you see that little hole on the bumper? They put a crank on the front of the engine. You can literally pop a bar into here and hand crank the engine over to start it. I really wish I could give it a try, but we don't have the crank unfortunately, and there aren't too many Lada parts sellers in the US either. As mentioned before, the car is rear-wheel drive, though it's more just out of simplicity's sake than any sort of performance reason, and there is a 4-speed manual transmission. I mean, still, rear-wheel drive and manual, that's already more than most new sports cars can say these days. Now, all this stuff, looks and mechanics-wise, sounds great for the 60s when the original Fiat 124 was first made, but by the 80s when this one was made, it's starting to get a bit outdated, but you know, it's meant to be an economy car, so whatever. Well, shockingly, production didn't stop in the 80s. It didn't even stop in the 90s. The Lada 1300 2106 was made all the way up until 2006 with only very small changes made. What's even crazier though is the 2104 and 2107, which are very similar models, were made until 2012. They just could not kill this car. I mean, geez, I guess people had to have kept buying them for them to stick around this long. Funny enough, they still had to safety test these things and were given 0 out of 4 stars by Russian safety officials in the 2000s. Nobody was surprised, I'm sure. Also, I do have to say these seatbelts suck. I've used lots of old-fashioned seatbelts and these are by far the worst. They don't retract, which I'm not surprised by, but they are just impossibly tight to adjust. Like, I've tried for minutes on end and just gave up, so I guess I'm riding with a loose seatbelt now. It's more like they just put them on there just because they had to rather than to actually use them. Another funny thing is the car apparently even comes with a little first aid kit, so without any airbags, crumple zones, or retracting seatbelts, you may not be safe in a crash, but you're at least prepared to patch yourself up if you do end up T-boned. Luckily, I don't plan on crashing this car, but let's go take it for a ride. This isn't my first time driving the car. I actually have taken this thing around town a few times before just because it's pretty fun to drive. Just right off the bat, though the car lacks in horsepower, it's got some good torque and is super easy to drive. It actually pulls surprisingly well. I mean, pulls well for cruising around town, not necessarily racing off the line. Also, I guess it more just feels like it pulls well. The speedometer seems to disagree. But still, it is very smooth and doesn't feel too gutless. Plus, just listen to that exhaust. Don't hear too many economy commuters sounding like that these days. It's worth noting the tall floor-mounted shifter is a lot slower to operate than the shorter center console ones we have on most cars today. The soft suspension may be nice for the rocky, unpaved roads of Russia, but have a huge effect on turning. There is so much roll you actually have to be really careful not to turn too hard at higher speeds. You really feel like you're just floating on top of the road until you turn or hit the brakes and the car starts rocking. I know I said the car just looked and felt Russian, but I am not kidding when I say this thing handles as if it's had a few too many shots of vodka itself. But okay, how about we try the car on some non-paved roads and see it a bit more in its natural element. I mean, yeah, the floatiness of the suspension definitely makes more sense off-road here, and it's a smooth ride for sure, but I still wouldn't go around saying this is a rally machine. The car is in no way performance-oriented. There isn't really much else to say about the driving, but it's honestly pretty darn fun to drive in a how does this exist sort of way, especially when we are so used to even the cheapest cars these days feeling sporty by comparison to this. Or at least not feeling like they're gonna flip over, making a turn faster than 30 miles an hour. And the Lada's got a full set of back seats, so you can cruise around town with your comrades in your Lada and all get the strangest looks at car meets. With all my driving impressions, it's worth noting this is a basically restored mint Lada, and I can imagine most of these cars today are not in this shape, so probably drive a lot worse. Like many cheap cars back in their day, Ladas were hated and seen as a joke you wouldn't want to be caught dead in. But also like many cheap cars, they are now being seen today more and more with a lens of nostalgia and charm. I can definitely see how if you owned this car back in the day, you could hate it. With how common and cheap they were, there were probably lots of poorly cared for ones on the used market back then on top of that. Plus, again, they were never the nicest to begin with. In the US especially, it's kind of funny that Ladas are seen as cool and foreign, and people get really excited to see them because they're so rare and just so ridiculous. Lots of people say old beater Hondas and Toyotas are some of the most fun economy cars to drive, but those people have never driven a Lada. I definitely am not setting any lap times in one of these, but just the act of surviving is a win in itself. Given the fact this is an 80s Soviet car based on a 60s Italian design, and they never even came to the US, for me here, it is in no way an ordinary car despite its simple utilitarian concept, but the Lada is still proof you don't need to be the fastest, the sleekest, or the safest car to be a fun one.